Welcome to those of you tuning in to this webcast from wherever you are. The Asia Society Policy Institute is proud to host today's event with our sister centers, the Asia Society Australia and the Asia Society Northern California. If you'd like to ask a question during this webcast, please submit your questions to the chat on YouTube or comment on Facebook, and I will do my best to get to them in the second half of this event. Over the past year and a bit, those of us privileged enough to be connected to the internet have come to realize just what a lifeline technology has been for our daily lives, especially as we've been physically cut off from each other because of the pandemic. And even as we begin to cautiously reimagine our lives beyond these screens, there are still many questions about how cyber and other technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing, and others will continue to shape our economy, security, and some, like our guest today would say, values. There are many countries with national cybersecurity policies and strategies, but not many with international engagement strategies on technology. Last month, Australia's Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, launched the country's international cyber and critical technology engagement strategy as a framework to guide Australia's diplomatic efforts across the range of these tech-related issues. But how does Australia's engagement strategy translate into on-the-ground impact for its neighbours in Southeast Asia, and indeed the larger Asian region at one level? And how does it fit into the larger geotechnological puzzle of intensifying US-China relations at a higher level? Dr. Tobias Feakin is Australia's inaugural Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology. He's been in this position as Australia's chief techplomat, if you will, since 2017, but recently had his portfolio expanded to recognize the ever-growing role of technology in geopolitics. He is the person who, together with his team, led the effort resulting in Australia's international cyber and critical technology engagement strategy. Ambassador Feakin, terrific to have you with us today. Tell us, if you will, what is Australia's engagement strategy on cyber and critical tech, and what does it all mean for Asia and the United States?
Elina, thank you firstly so much for hosting me today. It's always a pleasure to see you and have a conversation with you. I think our conversations on these issues have gone back way before I was in this position even. So I'm looking forward to some of the curveballs you often do throw me along the way in any of our conversations. And, you know, real pleasure for to meet virtually everyone who's on the call today. You know, I'm really delighted to be able to share with you today Australia's new international cyber and critical tech engagement strategy. If anyone's interested online, you can go and find its contents and have a look round all of the different aspects of the work that we do in this front, and it's internationalcybertech.gov.au, and you'll find all sorts of interesting pieces of work and how the strategy fits together on that website. I really only wish that actually the circumstances would allow us to all be meeting in person. And I think to your point, Elina, it's really is testament to the power of the internet and the way that we've just seen a fundamental reshaping of the way that we as individuals are operating, businesses, governments have digitized and undertaken digital transformation processes in every aspects of our lives, which in many respects, you know, could have taken years, if not decades, and have ended up taking a matter of weeks to throw our lives online, which is amazing when you think what it's allowed to enable during such a stressful and difficult time. But it's also opened up a whole new avenue of issues and risks that we also have to deal with at the same time. And I'll go on to talk a little bit about, you know, some of the ways in which not only the internet, but a lot of the technologies that it enables will, I think, bring us through and out the other side of the COVID situation that we currently find ourselves in. These technologies that we cover in this strategy really are the kind of fundamental building blocks of the 21st century geopolitical economic landscape. And that's something that's just become increasingly evident in the time that I've been in this position in a way that I'm not sure that any of us could have quite imagined would be the case when we are entering into, well, firmly into 2021 and into the 2020s. Now, and I think that's a good way to begin the conversation, is around setting the scene. Elina, you went some way to introducing that to us, but why do we need a strategy in this context? What is it that's going on that would demand a government to begin to strategize and conceptualize what it is that it needs to do in that international environment to ensure that it's well positioned in this tech landscape? Well, as I said, technology is fundamentally shifting the way we live, work, play, interact with one another far faster than ever before, and COVID has certainly accelerated that. But it's also the fact that there are certain key technological advancements that are all maturing at a very similar rate of knots, many of which are built off the backbone infrastructure that cyberspace provides us with, and the data that it creates, whether that be AI, quantum computing, blockchain, and a whole long list of others, which you'll all be well accustomed to hearing about, which, countries, if they are at the forefront of those technologies, will find themselves at the forefront of the 21st century economy and power base for the rest of the century and potentially beyond. Therefore, you are seeing, the geopolitical contestability of these technologies and the way that they're governed becoming ever more increasingly important and prominent in policymaking circles. And it is actually, it'd be hard to even imagine where we'd be during current context without the internet as if you like a building block to all of this. And it's hard to imagine what the toll would have looked like in terms of our connectivity and our economies had the internet not exist. And I think, harnessing the unprecedented technological change that we've been through in this time and adapting to the disruptions and leveraging the opportunities, it's vital for Australia in terms of how we recover. And it's important that we do that in a connected way with our partners and friends around the world and keep connected. Some of the challenges that we're seeing in this increasingly interconnected world are some of the challenges to our values, to our human rights and our freedoms, and also ethical questions that are being posed around certain technological advancements which have significant real-world practical impacts. If you like, how technologies are ethically and values-based decisions are made about how technologies are introduced and how they're utilized will have a great bearing on all of our futures. And so, for Australia, it's absolutely vital, along with any country around the world, that we try and manage both that opportunity and the risk piece very, very carefully. It's in the middle of that contested international environment where we're seeing that geostrategic competition play out. It's that environment that we're trying to address through a strategy like this. And I think, you mentioned at the beginning, we're one of the few countries that have a strategy like this. I can certainly tell you there are a few others who've published similar strategies or are in the process of developing them. And I think that's where we find ourselves, is that countries increasingly acknowledging that this environment is something that they are having to understand, work out what it means for their government and how they're going to address it from a policy point of view. So if they haven't published them yet, they're well on the pathway to addressing those issues as policy challenges. Unfortunately, what we see in that geostrategic environment is that states are willing to use technology to, whether it be deliberately undermine peace and stability, violate fundamental human rights and freedoms, and interfere in democratic processes and institutions that undermine sovereignty and security of other states, and also just misuse technology in other ways that undermine or directly threaten international peace and stability. I mean, we only need to look, and I've spoken a few times, and many of you will have heard it about, you know, what does the cyber threat landscape look like during a time of COVID? And, you know, certainly what we saw was a repurposing a lot of tools that were being used, certainly in the cyber criminal space, but even in the state-based environment, retargeting, repurposing of tools towards, if you like, using COVID as a smokescreen to deliver similar end results. Therefore, saw criminals utilizing COVID scams to be able to extract money from businesses, from the broader population. Saw states target health infrastructure, and especially in that international peace and security context, when we've agreed through UN processes and norms of responsible state behavior, one of which is about critical national infrastructure being out of bounds. During peacetime, it's hard to envisage a more important piece of infrastructure than health infrastructure during a pandemic. And to see that targeted purposely by particular states, and there's been a range of examples that we've seen in the international environment over the last 15 months, is pretty hard to accept. And Australia's certainly been very strong in making various representations, especially through the UN, but also trying to inform all of our stakeholders about what those vulnerabilities are that are being exploited so they can plug the gaps. You know, that's a really important part of the work we've done, but to see that happen during a time of crisis is not just unfortunate, but is pretty difficult to accept. But it makes it more challenging for Australia and for any of us, any country involved, to maximize those significant opportunities if we are continually dealing with challenges of where others are trying to exploit this technology environment for nefarious purpose. So a long way of introducing the fact this is why Australia has placed cyberspace and critical technology as a top foreign policy priority. And as you know, you rightly pointed out, my minister, Foreign Minister Marise Payne, launched a new strategy, and this International Cyber and Critical Tech Engagement Strategy, on the 21st of April. And it's a statement of saying that, you know, our interests are not served by turning inwards or letting others shape the global order. Our interests are served by engaging outwardly and trying to shape that tech environment in a way that is as close to our interests and our shared interests and values as possible. And, you know, we're committed, Australia's committed to multilateral cooperation in support of an open rules-based order and to help address global challenges, not to hinder them and make them any worse. And, you know, we're going to continue now off the back of this strategy to influence and shape critical institutions where our values, our security and our economic equities are all at stake. And that includes ensuring that any new rules, norms, standards on cyber and critical technology support an open international system and are consistent with universal values and human rights, especially privacy protections and freedom of expressions and belief. And we launched the strategy on the basis of those core elements. And it recognizes that all of these mediums are central to Australia's future, and especially in the context we find ourselves. You know, we know that we benefit from the growth of a connected, prosperous and resilient Indo-Pacific and world enabled by safe and secure critical technologies. And it builds on our 2017 cyber engagement strategy, Elina, which you had a hand in. We can perhaps talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. But it builds on that. It's still, it reflects what's changed since 2017. And many of the drivers and foundations of that piece of work are still highly relevant to our engagement, but it needs to expand, reflecting the increasing interconnectedness between cyberspace and critical technology. And it doesn't diminish our focus on international cyber policy, and you know, that remains at the heart of what we do, but it's recognizing that that expanded mandate needs to be addressed. And we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. So let me tell you a little bit about the strategy and just kind of some of the core elements of it. As I said, the key goal is for a safe, secure, prosperous Australia, Indo-Pacific and world, which is enabled by these technologies. And, you know, for us, that's the key to our economy, prosperity, preserving our national security and protecting free and open democratic international peace, ensuring international peace and stability, and protecting our economic, trade and development interests. So it's based around three key strands of thinking. The first of those, and again, Elina, you pointed it out, is that this is a strategy that's based firstly around what are the values that we want to look for in technology development itself, but also in terms of the international global environment in which technology is absorbed into. You know, we have committed to pursuing a values-based approach to cyberspace and critical tech, and oppose efforts to use technologies to undermine those values. You know, we look at issues, what are those values? Well, it's, you know, core of that, democratic principles, human rights, ethics of critical tech, diversity and gender equality, rule of law. And you know, those are all terms that are very well understood. And really that's a reflection of, again, it's not about reinventing you know, the whole values upon which Australia has been built over hundreds of years. It's just reinforcing those in the tech setting. And then, but it's also very clearly saying we have absolutely national security concerns in this environment. And what are our national security objectives in that regard? Well, you know, part of this picture is understanding what it is we want to protect and how we go about that in Australia, what's important to us, and what that means for our security settings internally. But it also means, well, what do we want to do about that international security environment? Because there's no doubting that, you know, increasingly some of these technologies will play an ever more important role in that international security environment. So, you know, how do we continue to try and ensure peace and stability in the international environment in light of this? How do we combat disinformation, misinformation? How do we continue to address cybersecurity issues, cybercrime, and the ever more difficult issue of online harms and safety? And then I think the final part, and something often we get into long conversations about the threats, but fundamentally all of these technologies are still enormous opportunities for all of us to enable our societies further, to connect us ever more, and to assist our economies. So in the prosperity part of the strategy, it's really about, well, how do we make the most of this environment for Australia? Well, it's through looking at market and supply chains and trying to understand what trusted market environments look like. How do we ensure that we don't get ourselves as a net technology importer into a situation of sole source supply, which, as we've seen, when you hit supply chain shocks, that disrupts supply chains in this technology space. It means that all of us as governments are thinking about how do we ensure that we don't run out of semiconductors, that we still do have a continual supply of the goods and services that we've come to expect. But also, how do we promote and engender better international outreach on research, industry and innovation issues? How do we engage in the critical technology standards environment, which is ever more important in international outreach? And I've never known tech standards to have such a high positioning within government as they do now. And I think that's an understanding that those tech standards bodies are shaping the ways in which technology is absorbed into the global settings. So we need to be shrewd about how we go about that technology standard shaping. And that's somewhere where that, if you like, the multi-stakeholder term comes into play, because we can't do that alone as governments. It has to be done in partnership with our industry bodies and parts of the tech industry to ensure that we're really pushing hard in the right direction in that. And we still can't ignore the internet governance discussion, which plays into all of this environment where we still have certain states who would rather see a far stronger hand, and certainly from authoritarian states, that government should be the arbiter of how the internet is owned and run. That is still very present and very live, and has been so for a long time now. But also, what do we do about the trade environment? How do we ensure that our trade negotiators and our trade deals are reflecting this new technology environment that we currently are entering into? And also, ultimately, we want to enhance our tech diplomacy or our technomats. I can't remember the word term you used. Sorry, I'm forgetting the word you used, Elina. But ultimately, where we want to get to is the fact that we should all, in the foreign policy environment and in foreign ministries and across our government structures, be very comfortable in the idea that we're all tech diplomats. It should be a very common part of our lexicon, our conversations, and our engagement with other countries, because it is such a central part of our lives. So whilst we're going about enhancing how we conduct our diplomacy, the ultimate aim is that we are all proficient in engaging on these issues. And really that's what the strategy tries to do, which is give very straightforward language and engagement principles for anyone to be able to pick up and begin to engage on these issues. And we do a huge amount of training with our diplomats to ensure that they have a better understanding before they go out to posts, and also internally, so that those principles and aspects of our work are truly understood and they can take that on when they get to postings. So what does it mean? And you asked the question, and I realize I'm talking an awful lot now. Maybe we should get into a bit more Q&A for this conversation. But it means a lot for our collaboration and cooperation with the US and throughout the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific. And our collaboration will take so many different forms. It means strengthening our engagement with like-minded democracies to pursue our collective interests and values, working through our bilateral partnerships, groupings such as the Quad, the ASEAN Regional Forum, where I know you've had a lot of experience, Elina, the East Asia Summit, Pacific Islands Forum, the list goes on. But it's working through those groupings to where these issues are ever more present in the discussions and the outcomes, documents, and actions that are taken. For example, this year the Quad leaders established a new critical and emerging tech working group to drive Quad action on democratic principles for technology, future connectivity, diversification of technology supply chains, and coordinated engagement in standard settings. And we can never ignore the United Nations. There's a ever-growing body of work going on at the UN on multilateral rule setting, so we have to stay engaged there. But really, one of the key ways that we do that, and happy to dig into more of this detail in the Q&A, is through the Cyber and Critical Tech Cooperation Program, which operates in the Indo-Pacific. And if anyone wants to go onto the website and have a look, it shows you the countries that we've been working in over the past 4.5 years. And we announced just shy of $40 million of new investment in that program at the launch, 20.5 million for working in Southeast Asia, 17 million in the Pacific, to work on some of the core issues that are outlined in this strategy, and assisting partners understand what that means for them in this new technology environment. And since 2017, Australia's increased its funding in capacity building from a $4 million investment in 2017 to now just shy of $100 million in this same area. And it just really reflects the growing importance of this kind of work in our overseas development assistance channels. And I can happily talk more about our capacity building. I'm very pleased to wax lyrical about that, because I think it's so vital part of the work that we do. But equally, we need to enhance our cooperation with industry, civil society, and academia. And it's not so much that it's something new that diplomats need to engage with all different partners wherever they may be. But in this area of work, if you don't engage in those areas of work and absorb some of that thinking into your policy making and the way you deliver, then you're set to fail. And a couple of examples of that, we set up with my Danish colleagues who have a tech ambassador in Silicon Valley, a cyber and tech retreat where we bring 25 of these kinds of positions together from around the world and engage with very, very senior tech leaders to talk through some of the key challenges that we're facing in that international relations arena around tech, and try and think about what some of those solutions might be. And last year we established a Quad Tech Network, which is a kind of track 2/research grouping that provides recommendations and looks at shared challenges facing Australia and the Quad partners in this cyber and tech environment. We do a huge amount of work through the ARF in building regional stability and transparency. That's been a long-term engagement by Australia in those processes. And again, happy to discuss some of that, but it's really based around the idea that it's about implementing practical, useful measures to enhance trust and confidence in our region. And I think the progress that's been made through the ARF on those issues is quite remarkable now, and we're in a much more engaging conversation through those bodies than we perhaps were before. And I'm happy to talk a bit about the capacity building that we're looking at in Asia, perhaps in the Q&A, and some of the focuses that might take. Perhaps I'll leave that for the Q&A because I realize I'm talking for well over 20 minutes now. But I mean, really, it's, you know, we've published a strategy. Now it's about how do you deliver that? How do you reach out to other partners? I would say in terms of the capacity building work we do, one of the core features of that is how we work with private sector, NGOs, academia, think tanks to deliver and multiply our impact in what we're doing internationally. And I think there's some real success stories to refer to in that regard. It's about kind of creative thinking, collaborative work, and what we've discovered is that government can extend its reach way beyond what it would achieve by itself had it not chosen to work in such creative ways. I've probably talked so much that we've probably sent everyone to sleep at the end of a long day over there in stateside. And perhaps woken up a few in Australia, who knows. But Elina, look, perhaps I'll toss back to you and we could have a bit of a conversation around some of what I've just introduced. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Ambassador. And just the coverage of all these issues, I think, is testament to and reflective of just how many of these issues are actually covered in the strategy itself. And we talked a little bit about this before this webcast, about just the amount of topics in the strategy itself. And so there's a lot to dig into. But perhaps if I can just take a step back and ask you for your definition or interpretation of what exactly critical tech is for Australia. What makes tech critical for Australia?
Yeah, and we purposely keep that very, very simple. And actually, I will just add, you know, we purposely also haven't published like a long list of here are all the critical technologies that we believe are critical. Yes, of course, that work goes on in a classified environment, but actually for a strategy like this, which is so broad, this was about setting out the overriding architecture, if you like, of how we want to engage on technology writ large. But for, you know, a critical technology, pure and simple, it's any technology that has a significant impact across any of those issues we've had. You know, does it have a significant impact on your economic future and present? Does it have a significant impact on your national security, both now and potentially in the future? And therefore something becomes critical once it begins to be quite obvious that it does have an impact on your national interest writ large. And we've purposely kept that simple because also the other thing is, you know, there's lots of terms bandied around, whether it might be emerging technology, you know, foundational technology, whatever it might be. Now, the reason we've stuck to critical is that, you know, many technologies are there which are emerging, but they might not actually be critical to any of our kind of core national interests. They might be wonderful in terms of what they do, but they don't actually, if you like, cross that threshold of being critical to any of those particular core national interests that we've expressed in this strategy and other strands of work that are going on inside government. So yeah, purposely kept it flexible. And I think, you know, if there's a watchword in any kind of tech policy setting, it's try and increase the flexibility and maneuverability that you can give yourselves as government to work in a tech space which is just evolving at light speed. And that's one of the interesting features, right, of the international multilateral discussion. It moves quite slowly in comparison to the way that the technologies are advancing. You know, even if you think back to 1998, when the first introduction of information security issues was brought by Russian colleagues into the United Nations, you know, technologically speaking, that's a lifetime ago. And you know, but in a multilateral arms control, if that's, you know, if you want to compare it to the arms control environment, that's not such a long time. And so I think for any policy making, if you can increase that flexibility and maneuverability of government to work with the technology, those that are developing it, and the way in which circumstances change, then you're better equipped in the long term.
Yeah, and so in this awkward conflation of the speed of technology and the speed of government and how governments usually work, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what has changed since 2017. You talked about the 2017 strategy that Australia had. What has changed in those 4 years, 4 years that have warranted this update in this iteration of the strategy?
I mean, I get that there was something quite straightforward to begin with, which was we were committed to looking to update this every 3 years. But I would say in terms of content and what had occurred in the global scene, you know, when we produced that strategy in 2017 and the position itself, having an ambassador for cyber affairs at the time, was a reflection of the Australian government saying, this is strategically now a much more core part of any of our international engagements. We need a senior representative inside government who can pull together what we do in Australia and assist in representing us and helping other government departments project that out into the international environment. So it was a reflection of where we were, which was cybersecurity was increasingly moving away from being that technical discussion to more of a policy and a strategic policy discussion, and ever more central to international engagements, whether it be at the ministerial level all the way through our government cycle. And the strategy that we wrote then was reflective of that. It embodied, you know, the things that Australia wanted to achieve in that sense, and it still now is an incredibly forward-leaning strategy, and that's really where Australia finds itself. Is that, and purposely so, is that it is very forward-leaning in its cyber and tech policy across, and you look across the Australian government system, and the Australian government makes very forward-leaning tech policy. Whether it be in the national security space with colleagues at the Home Affairs Department, whether it be in our industry policy through our Department of Industry, through our Prime Minister and Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and some of the things they're doing in the digital environment and the Critical Tech Coordination Office. You know, there's so many really interesting pieces of work which make us, I think, stand out from a policy point of view. But what changed during that time is that a plethora of discussions on cyber, and I'm sure, Elina, you found this when you were on a panel or in any bilateral conversation with other senior people, wherever they may be, in academia or in government, you'd often go from a cyber conversation in merging into quickly AI, quantum computing, and what about this distant tech future? And then what happened was you saw very distinct policies made from certain key superpowers, which are about laying a marker down that we want to be at the forefront of AI developments and investing, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in that area of technology, or in quantum computing. And suddenly you began to see how there were very strong geostrategic statements being made about investments in key technology areas. Now, I guess that's fairly normal in you know, over centuries. We've seen that in key technology areas, but not in such a concentrated area of digital technology maturation. And I think that then you saw the trade disputes between US and China, which really pushed this into the absolute center ground. The discussion around 5G technologies, telecommunications becoming ever more central in that global context. So you just saw how the plethora of advanced technology, critical technologies becoming discussed in the international environment just required that you have a strategy inside government at very least, if not, you know, producing that externally to guide yourselves and also other countries and industry and civil society in understanding, well, what does that environment look like and how are we going to engage around it? It's significant in a way that I probably didn't expect when I began this work 4.5 years ago. And I've been involved in tech policy since the late 90s, which is a lifetime ago, right? So, you know, I probably didn't expect it to be quite so central at this point, but it is. And I think that's a fact of life. And you find governments around the world trying to puzzle their way through what their approach is going to be.
I'd like to turn the discussion towards Asia. And everybody talks about Asia being the dynamo of the world economy in the next few years. And certainly there's a lot of technological focus as well on the region right now. You talked about a retreat in Silicon Valley with your Danish counterpart. I wonder if there is at some point in the near future, you might consider a retreat in Asia itself, given the importance of Asia. But also, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the capacity building work that Australia has been doing as part of this strategy in ensuring some of the objectives that matter to Asia, perhaps more than just security. And one of the values of the strategy, one of the pillars of the strategy is, of course, prosperity, which is a pillar that is very strongly advanced in Asia. How has the strategy helped or begun to help with connectivity and ensuring that there is resilience in technology for the people on the ground in Asia?
Look, those are all really good questions. The Asia Pacific technology environment is undoubtedly just vibrant. Is a good starting place. Exciting is another great word to use about what this innovation environment looks like in the region. When you look at the kind of number of unicorns now, those fabled companies that are tipping over the 1 billion mark, so many of those in our region exist in Indonesia. And the startup culture in Indonesia is just quite remarkable to feed off the energy that exists there and some of the really interesting disruptive business models that have been developed there. And you see now the increasing interest of the really big tech firms from US in investing in some of those apps that, we may have been using for many years in our travels around Asia Pacific, but are not so, weren't so well known stateside and in Europe. But that's changing now, and you're seeing the growth in those areas. And I mean, inescapable the fact that Beijing has enormous startup vibrancy, and the tech environment there is just racing so fast it's almost impossible to keep up. But that's true of many of our partners around the region, and I could keep naming different countries and some of the things they're doing, but it's just, as you rightly say, it's electric. And so, I think your suggestion is an excellent one. And many of the other ambassadors or equivalent positions that we have in that grouping are from the region. And that's important that that's the case, because I think many of the positions like mine are grappling with being often in the middle of that geostrategic contest. So the policy choices are really very difficult and laden with, consequence. Both good and bad at times, and you see that play out often. So I think your suggestion is a really, really useful one, and one that, whilst we're engaging with similar positions, and I do a huge amount of bilateral work around the region, even in these times of virtual meetings, I'm on and off calls constantly. Is that we should be thinking more directly about some of the big tech industry in our region and how we engage there. Some of that's easier said than done, if I can be honest. I think, if you're talking about big tech industry in the US and Europe, you can even see there with the cycles of their policy functions. Many companies are still really only just maturing their approach to how they engage on policy, and out through circumstance in many regards, because there's an understanding now you can't avoid the policy discussion. It's there, it's present, and governments are getting stronger in the way that they're looking at that policy environment, and rightly so in many respects. There's been a good chunk of time where that policy environment has been pretty free and completely enabling for industry, and it's quite obvious now we're in a different time. The internet is very different place to that which it was only 10 years ago. And that perhaps is a good linkage into the capacity building side, because that's come through increased connectivity, increased internet take up, whether it be through broadband, but predominantly now through mobile phone access. And that connectivity piece is enabling socioeconomic development at a rate of knots. There are various reports about, what percentage of GDP is added for 1% increased connectivity in each country, but it's significant. I won't quote them because, there are varying reports, but what is certain is that with increased connectivity comes increased opportunity for socioeconomic development. And that's actually become a core part of the work that the Australian government has done in actually providing some of that physical backbone infrastructure for broadband networks. So we invested in the Coral Sea Cable, which links Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands into Sydney, and fundamentally reshapes the access to high-speed broadband internet. But on the back of that, very cognizant of the fact that increased connectivity, increased numbers of first-time users going online means that first-time users are some of the most vulnerable and susceptible to cybercrime and related online harms. And so therefore, along with that infrastructure delivery, we're very cognizant, and we concentrate a lot in terms of our capacity building of trying to ensure that there's good cybersecurity awareness, ability to deliver cybersecurity, and good cyber policy in place too. Perhaps one of the most significant ways that we've done that is in Papua New Guinea, where we invested around $14 million in creating a cybersecurity operations center in Port Moresby with the PNG government, but then ensuring, and one of the watchwords in all of our capacity building work is sustainability. And so ensuring that it's not just providing some technology and know-how, it's doing that in partnership with training, and software upgrades to ensure that continues to be a maturing capability. And I'm really pleased to say that that project is going really, really well, and lots of really interesting career development that I've seen with some of the PNG government staff that we've been working with, and learning cycles to the point now that it's really their facility and providing a good cybersecurity capability for that nation. So that's one standout example. But what we've done is I hinted at it in the opening comments that I made, is that we've really looked to work strongly with partners. So when we began this journey back in 2017, I think we had 2 partners that we worked with on capacity building programs. We threw the net wide and basically did some open calls to see what kinds of partnerships could be created. And we're now working with somewhere in the region around 50 different partners. And that is from big multinational brands like Qantas Airlines, Ernst & Young, big banking sector in Australia. And then I'm really pleased to say that we're going to be running a project with the FSISAC, which is the threat information sharing platform for the financial industry, and doing some uplift in that area across the region soon too, working with a whole range of academic partners, think tanks and NGOs. And fundamentally, that shifted the reach that we have. And I think the uplift and the impact that we have on broader civil society, because there's many who won't want to listen to a government-run program, but they'd love to engage with some of those brands and what they bring to the table in terms of uplift. So I'm proud of the way that area of work has matured. What else have we done? We've also, through that program, tried to create seed funding for startups who have really innovative ways of looking at the digital environment and how it can help socioeconomic development. And an example is that we created some money sourcing for startups to apply for in Solomon Islands to link up the education sector to the jobs market, and try and make sure that was a more fluid flow of knowledge into the correct job environment in the Solomon Islands. And actually great deal of success we had off the back of that. If anyone can be bothered, you can trawl through my Twitter feed and find out the details, but also they should be there on the website that I mentioned at the beginning. So now where that work's expanding is expanding further to look at How do we assist other countries looking at that critical tech standards environment? How do they engage in that? How can we assist equipping with knowledge on that front, and where to engage and how? How do we increase risk awareness around new infrastructure builds and good policy decisions around understanding the infrastructure investments that you're about to make, especially in telecommunications, and generally looking at that cyber and critical tech resilience piece in Southeast Asia. And through doing that, we strongly feel that that has so many multiple benefits, not only for the partners that we work with in country, but also for Australia as well. You know, a more cyber and critical tech resilient region we have, the better positioned Australia is domestically as well.
Fantastic. I just want to pause here, and as a reminder to our audience, if you do have questions or suggestions, please feel free to convey them through YouTube or Facebook, and I'll pick them up and send them over to the ambassador. But I want to be perhaps a little more provocative, and you know this from me from a while back, and ask about the other pillar of the strategy, which is the pillar on values. One of the things that I liked about the strategy was that it talks about how Australia is prepared to work with those who do not necessarily share its values. But how do you reconcile that with almost a drawing of the line, for example, on this issue of values and technology? Because there's no country that would come out explicitly to say, well, we're against human rights or we're against ethics or inclusion. How do you reconcile those two positions in the strategy?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think one of the things to deal with here is like, you know, that isn't saying in an absolute way that every single aspect of that is always going to have to be, you know, be a complete deal breaker in everything we do. What that does is set out what are the values that we as a country want to embody and will talk about and will stand by in multilateral conversations and in standard setting organizations. And that's predominantly because we, in the technology development cycle, you know, look, tech reflects the society that it's being used in. I think that is a very simple statement, but very true. So how do you affect that? It's by reaching out to the tech developers and saying, well, what are your values in terms of your innovation cycle? What do you bake in from the outset? Do you even think about values when you're developing tech? And there's varying answers depending on where you go in industry for that. So I think for any company seeing the values that, you know, and seeing the expectations that we have helps them in their innovation cycle if they're wanting to engage in the Australian market environment. And I think, you know, as a statement of principle, that's really important. And let's be honest, a lot of the big tech industry at the moment, it's quite hard to understand some of those values and where they lie, because they do seem to shift an awful lot depending on the market environment that they're operating in. That's the first part. The second part, where those values will be really important and really important to be mindful of and engaging with, is in, it might sound strange, but that technical standards environment where, yes, it becomes a very technical discussion, but you need to have those values front of mind, because values are going to be shaped by the end results of those standards. And we shouldn't be under any illusions that there's a very different, very authoritarian vision of how technology can be utilized and shaped through those standard setting bodies, which is very much in direct contrast to the kinds of values that we've placed there. So that's one part, if you like, that's one part of it. The other part is, you know, in our engagements, of course, look, countries have differences. You know, no one country is the same. So it's not written with the expectation that every single country we engage with must have those same values. You'd find yourself in probably a fairly lonely spot, but it's finding where you have shared values and where you can address perhaps some of the values that we don't agree on in a way that leads to better outcomes. So I think it's not being afraid of engagement with those who don't have entirely, you know, same value sets. I mean, that in some ways is what makes the world so interesting, right? But there are some core values there. And I think something to leave anyone on this call with is understand how important that is, because right now we have a window to shape the technology space in terms of how it's being absorbed, how these new technologies, these critical technologies, are being absorbed into the global setting. And if we don't engage with that and be very thoughtful about the values that we want technologies to embody and to provide us with as societies, well, if we don't do that now, I'm concerned, we're concerned that we end up in a world that is not favorable to the way we currently live. I don't know if that's direct enough for everyone, but the more authoritarian vision of how technologies are used is certainly not something that Australian values are based on.
Yes, and of course we've seen examples of how those authoritarian uses of technology have also occurred in democratic societies or nominally democratic societies. But there's always masterful diplomatic response from you, Ambassador. I want to tease that values discussion a little bit more. And part of those values, I think, as reflected in the strategy, also talks about diversity and inclusion. And so one of the questions that has come in is during COVID, we've already seen how access to digital infrastructure or technology as a whole has been extremely uneven. And parts of the developing world, including Southeast Asia, even the Pacific, has resulted in an unequal access to women, indigenous populations, and other minority communities. How does the strategy help to ensure that these communities are also included as part of the technological advancement?
Yep. Look, I'm really great question, and something that I'm pleased to say, been thinking an awful lot about already through our outreach work, because all of those dynamics that you've explained absolutely been heightened in current context, have been very strong in our thinking about how we shape our capacity building work. And what we're making a commitment to is that will become ever more clear in the work that we do going forward. Some of the programs of work that we've already been looking at in this regard is, at a more, if you like, policy strategic level, with other partners, trying to push and enable female leaders to be, have as much as we can provide in terms of information around the multilateral environment and what all the key debates are, and facilitating their involvement in, very expensive UN engagements. And this was pre-COVID, and actually leading to, and it's a bit sad to say, but equally also uplifting that it's finally happened, actually achieving gender parity in a UN, 193 countries having gender parity in one of the particular voting processes that went through there, and very proud that we made a contribution towards that. So some of it's about enabling that engagement internationally and beyond, but also there's a great deal of work now and investments that we're making in exactly what the question has asked for. How do we enable women and other minorities to be able to be connected, have access to digital platforms. And some of the work we've done is on creating remote solar infused access to the internet, which are in far more remote parts of the Pacific Islands, for example, to ensure that there is that more direct access, and it's not done over a phone, which can be kept by one individual and then access controlled, but in a very public place where someone can access that, whoever they may be, from whatever background. And there's a whole degree of other programming that will become very public. I'm afraid I haven't signed the contracts on it right now, so I'm afraid I can't announce it, that I think will just be a very direct answer to what's being said. Is such an important issue. And something else that has been very, very disheartening in this current environment is how also digital platforms have also been used for increasing amounts of online harm to women and to those from various different diverse backgrounds. And something I'm really proud of is the work that we do with the e-safety commissioner in Australia, in reaching out to Pacific partners and beyond, in looking at the model that she uses, Julian McGrath, on how you try and empower women in those kinds of situations and environments. And I'm pleased to say through the collaborative work that we've done and funding that DFAT has assisted with, Fiji has now got an e-safety commissioner who's doing exactly the same thing in Fiji in terms of empowering women in the online space and to ensure that those harms aren't as present as they currently are. So we're on it. You ever quite doing enough on that front? No. I think the fact that you're seeing that issue highlighted in our strategy shows how important we think it is. And I think more countries should be placing these issues at the heart of these kinds of strategies. It's vital to a kind of equitable future in the cyber and critical tech environment. And to be frank, if we're not enabling women from a gender perspective in this environment, well, you're economically going to miss out. And that's one of the kind of stark issues here, is that whilst we have a male-dominated environment of cybersecurity delivery and many of these critical tech areas, I mean, imagine what our economies would look like if we had a far higher percentage of women involved in STEM and in also all of these areas too. So it just makes sense from so many different angles, whichever way you look at it.
I'm personally heartened to hear you say that. We only have a few minutes left, but you've been very optimistic, but also very grounded in the realities of the tech space in the region. One of the questions that was posed is, would like to seek your views on some of the larger challenges that you see in implementing this engagement strategy moving forward. What do you think those are?
I think there's multiple challenges, and I'm glad I've sounded so positive. I'm intentionally trying to be very positive because I think it is, on the whole, an enormous opportunity for all of us. But there's significant challenges. It's when dealing with such complex technologies which can offer so much benefit, but can also be switched very easily to be very strong control measures on your societies. It's often the easiest solution to head down that path. And I will just challenge you in terms of, saying you see in Western societies utilizing similar approaches. Well, I would disagree. It becomes a very kind of fine discussion, but there's a difference when you are trying to protect your citizens' national security. And when you implement and create that policy, it will be done through due legal process with controls, with concerns for people's privacy, their human rights, and all those basic principles that a policy process will go through, which just won't happen in an authoritarian country. So, I mean, you didn't state that, Elina, but I've had questions where there's been direct comparisons made between an authoritarian regime's policy and something that's happened in Australia. And I take great umbrage at that, because it's hugely disrespectful and totally misunderstanding of how policies are made in a liberal democracy. There's contestability of ideas, there's challenge, there's, all sorts of discussion and consultation, which maybe, you appreciate when you're inside government, but, population should be very aware of that. There are distinct, enormous differences. But I think one of the fundamental challenges we have here is that, that authoritarian model can be quite attractive and almost the easier decision to make at times. But if those decisions are made, and there's a danger that countries will head towards that because it is so easy and attractive, that you'll end up in a future which is so draconian and controlled that it's not a future that I look at favorably at all. And I enjoy what tech does for me in my life and for our societies, but I worry equally that if we end up towards a more dystopian connected future, then that's going to be a very seriously restrictive, controlled, and unfavorable environment for all of us. So, it's down to us to work collectively and in our international outreach to make sure that future isn't the future that exists. So, yeah, I'm very clear-eyed about that and the ways in which other countries are pushing for a very different future to the one that I hope all of us on this call and way beyond would want to enjoy through these amazing tech advances.
That's great. I was hoping you'd challenge me a bit there, and I'm glad you lived up to that. Master Feakin, we've come to the end of our time. You've been so generous with your own time and so very frank with your insights. Always appreciated. I know firsthand that you and your team have worked extremely hard over the past few years since your office was created to help make these large strides in tech capacity building in the Asia Pacific in particular. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you zooming everywhere, whether physically or virtually through this app as part of that strategy. And we wish you nothing but the best in implementing the engagement strategy. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thank you to you and the Asia Policy Institute for hosting me.